Running love, but the emotions were vague. Tim, your bandmate in Psychic Craze, was encouraging me to come and see the Miranda and her alter ego record release. Even just like on the way to that show, I just thought that's such a powerful title for a record, post-traumatic growth. When you were performing at the record release, you said that the songs on the record were songs that you composed during the post-traumatic growth period, as opposed to necessarily being the statement of the post-traumatic state, the state post-trauma. Could you expand a bit on how the creative burst of all that songwriting relates to either the trauma or the experience of integration and discovering your power that you were just describing?
Yeah, I mean, um, I had never really considered myself a musician. Like, I'm an amateur at best, and I've accepted that. But a lot of it was not even about composing or trying to even really direct any kind of narrative as much as it was I had all of these thoughts and feelings that I needed to release. And I needed a place to put them, and I needed to feel seen, and I needed to feel heard, and I needed to feel connected to something. And I felt like through that there was this sense of, hey, I do have a voice. Hey, I do have the ability, maybe not necessarily what other people might expect of me, but I was able to discover what I had,
Yeah.
what song I was singing. Everyone's got their own song, and I was able to discover my song, discover my voice. And I think a lot of that ties into Rising Strong, just in that it is that process of kind of unraveling yourself and discovering who you really are and what you're really capable of.
What you're
I don't know, is that a good enough answer?
That's a perfect
I
answer.
feel like I
That's a
didn't
perfect
fully
answer.
answer.
Insofar as it's perfect, insofar as it completely aligns with my sense of what post-traumatic growth is,
Yeah.
and with some of my experiences, especially discovering what one is capable of. Misconnection, where do I belong? Yeah, misconnection, where do I belong? Yeah, misconnection, where do I belong? Misconnection, where do I belong? Yeah, where do I belong? Yeah, where do I belong? Feeling okay? Let's listen. Here's the quotation that I think it would be good to start with. There it is. I'll read it to you. So, if to integrate means to make whole, then its opposite is to fracture, disown, disjoin, detach, unravel, or separate. I think many of us move through the world feeling this way. The irony is that we attempt to disown our difficult stories to appear more whole or more acceptable. But our wholeness, even our wholeheartedness, actually depends on the integration of all our experiences, including the falls. So that's from Brene Brown, in the book Rising Strong. What are your initial thoughts on that?
I resonated with that because I'm having a hard time personally integrating certain parts of myself. Um, I feel like the black sheep, and I feel like I don't really belong in certain communities or just different environments. I just always kind of felt like I didn't belong. And I always felt this need to cut off certain parts of myself in order to be accepted or to be loved. And I'm learning now that that's not a viable option. Like, that is just going to keep cropping up. And you really do have to integrate to survive and to also thrive.
Her starting point in that book is the passage about being in the arena. You did like a kind of bibliomancy once and it online, and it kind of, this passage came up. So it's a passage that resonated with you, and it's from Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt says, "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood." And then the passage continues, but Brene Brown says, imagine like a record coming to a halt just there. This is where I want to slow down and see what happens next. And she's just encouraging us to stay in this moment of being face down in the arena. We're too drawn to the idea of seeming whole to allow ourselves to recognize where we are, pick ourselves up when we feel that we've kind of fallen, and then really feel that power. That's where the true integration is. That's where the wholeheartedness is. And she finds herself, even though she is an academic, like a scholar, she's like a social scientist, and she's done lots of research and so on, she finds herself gravitating towards storytellers, to like Pixar. She makes friends with someone at Pixar, and she asks, what is the narrative? What's the structure of the Pixar stories? And when she goes there, she's told like it's act 1, act 2, act 3. And she realizes, oh, wow, that's like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. These books that Brene Brown's mum, books of Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, Brene Brown's mum would have those on her bookshelf. So Brene, when she goes to Pixar and she learns about the narrative of like the hero in the Pixar stories, she starts using storytelling much more, and she's turning to storytellers because she realizes that storytelling and creativity are the tools for the real integration.
One of the first things that we kind of connected on was I had given you this quote, and it was, all healing is a release of false beliefs.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that definitely ties into it. It's just like you're breaking down these mental blocks, and each mental block is like a level, and you kind of integrate, and then you level up, and then there's a new level.
Yeah.
And it never really ends until finally one day there's like this pivot, right? And this, in the Pixar story, this would probably be, the climax.
Mhm.
And then everything kind of plateaus from there, and you heal.
Yes, and you can say that with confidence because you heal. As you were saying that, I was initially feeling this helps us realize, okay, we're going around the mountain. The healing isn't linear, but there is progress as we're going up this mountain. It helps us, the real experience of healing and the removal of some of those false beliefs helps us avoid falling into the trap of thinking it's one and done. Like I'm healed.
Well,
But then
yeah,
the other thing you said was that then there are these kind of cataclysmic moments as well.
yeah, I definitely don't think that healing is linear, and that like one day you are just healed, because there's definitely going to be more potholes, and
Yeah.
you're gonna think you're healed, and then all of a sudden something is gonna trigger you, and you're like, oh my god, I didn't even realize that was still in me.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of part of the hero's journey, is it's like being brave, right? Like, not by the absence of things that make you afraid, but by being courageous and going forward, and continuing. And so a lot of that does come down to courage.
Certainly in the book, one of my favorite books, Power versus Force, that's the catalyst, that specific virtue, courage, the courage to allow oneself to be vulnerable and to be seen in this vulnerable state. Again, face down in the arena, what happens next? Well, one thing that could happen next is a courageous continuation.
I think the thing that is powerful about trauma that does make it so fertile, right? Like fertile grounds for growth is because you lose all sense of control, right? Like if you are in such a state where everything around you is falling apart and you don't have the ability to maybe necessarily handle these situations on your own, it's like you just get stripped completely naked, and there's no choice but to be courageous. It's not like I decided to be courageous. It was like I had to be. I
Mm.
had to be. And I had to learn these things the very, very hard way. I think there's something about that lack of control that gives you space to become more vulnerable. And that vulnerability creates space for growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the the control, the sense of control could be seen as the false self or the ego holding everything together through fear that if it doesn't, everything will fall apart. And then if that becomes less possible, then one possibility for what would happen next could be everything falls apart. But then another possibility could be we've got less of a tight hold on something that actually isn't fully serving us anymore. So there's this moment of possibility and promise. Something that really excited me recently, when I was beginning to work on my book that's emerging from Back to the City, in which there will be a chapter emerging from this present conversation. I was reading this book called The Happiness Advantage in relation to a chapter on Mark Mormon. And in it, there's a chapter which is very related to the conversation, similar territory to Rising Strong, called Falling Up, capitalizing on the downs to build upward momentum. I'm just going to quote something from this chapter called Falling Up from this book. And as someone who's experienced post-traumatic growth and who's documented that in your music, and you continue experiencing this and continue growing, I'm really interested in what you have to say about this attempt to kind of theorize it and make it scientific and so on.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
The human brain is constantly creating and revising mental maps to help us navigate our way through this complex and ever-changing world. Kind of like a tireless, over-eager cartographer. Okay, so that's at the beginning of the story. It's a story about the brain. The brain is making these maps. All human decisions involve this kind of mental mapping. They start with an I am here point, the status quo, from which a variety of paths radiate outward. The most successful decisions come when we are thinking clearly and creatively enough to recognize all the paths available to us and accurately predict where that path will lead. The problem is that when we are stressed out or in crisis, many people miss the most important path of all, the path up, the growth path. In the next few sentences, it's like path 1, path 2, and then he's proposing the third path, which is going to be the path of post-traumatic growth. On every mental map after crisis or adversity, there are 3 mental paths. One that keeps circling around where you currently are. Number 2 leads you towards further negative consequences, i.e., you are far worse off after the negative event. This path is why we are afraid of conflict and challenge. And one, which I call the third path, that leads us from failure or setback to a place where we are even stronger and more capable than before the fall. To be sure, finding that path in challenging times isn't easy, but study after study shows that if we are able to conceive of a failure as an opportunity for growth, we are all the more likely to experience that growth. By scanning our mental map for positive opportunities And by rejecting the belief that every down in life leads us only further downward, we give ourselves the greatest power possible, the ability to move up, not despite the setbacks, but because of them. In this chapter, you'll learn how. Businessman, I'm going to teach you how.
One thing I picked up is it's like the three paths, right? As if there's choice.
Mm.
But what always strikes me is why people make the choices they choose and like what mental state they are in and their preparedness to make those kind of choices. So I think a lot of what post-traumatic growth is it's kind of like I was saying, those mental blocks, right? You get those mental blocks, you start to overcome them, but it's not necessarily a choice. I feel like it's something you have to work up to. Like, I feel like you have to first circle around a little bit and then make those negative choices. And then you recognize, oh, wow, I made a poor decision. And then you kind of start to grow from those kind of lower level thinking. And then you kind of advance and mature into that more post-traumatic growth state. Some people are able to get there sooner than others, in which they're able to kind of think more rationally.
Mm.
But a lot of times people who are going through trauma are in this fight or flight mode. They're not thinking, it's very black and white. It's survival.
Mm.
And people will do a lot of strange things to try and survive. And they're not always rational. They're, kind of neurotic, or they're based in fear, or they're based in different false beliefs. So I do think that the reason that I even was able to create post-traumatic growth was because I had done some things that I don't know if I regret them, but I did some things that were not necessarily in my best interest. And I had to really, like I said, strip myself naked and be at a very low point of I have nothing but my neurotic tendencies and myself, and you're kind of forced to look at those things.
You came to the conclusion that some things that you had done were not in your best interest. Obviously, if someone external were to, show up and say, this isn't in your best interest, and here's the scientific data to show why, like that would have presumably stopped
Been a
what's
trigger.
happening from happening.
Yeah. I mean, so because I'm a behavioral support specialist now. So
Yeah.
I work with people who have disabilities, and it's interesting because now I get to walk them through the post-traumatic growth cycle. And sometimes I just want to tell them what to do. And
Mm.
it's like you really just have to go through it. You just
Yeah.
you have to go through it. You can't, like, the only real way to learn is through experience.
Could you expand a bit more on your present experience of being kind of on the other side and really lovingly desiring the person who is experiencing trauma? You have some understanding of what's happening, and you have experience and awareness of a way beyond it. Presumably, then you're torn between a sense of, well, if only I can say the right thing or communicate the right way, then the person can experience post-traumatic growth. But then your awareness, going back to your own experience, that isn't what led to post-traumatic growth for you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, particularly, there's just this one girl I work with. She's 16. So she's got a lot of work ahead of her yet. And it's hard because I try to tell her all of the things that I wish someone would have told me. But if you're not ready for it, if you're not doing the inner work, it's not going to land. Like, it's like throwing a wet noodle on the wall. Like, unless if it's ready, it's not going to stick, right? And so it's learning to just be there where they are, and reinforcing that this is your reality. And how do we manage the different emotions that come up with it? Like, what's happening? Like, how are you feeling? What are you thinking? What is your process? What led to this? I think a lot of time I just mirror what they're doing. Like, hey, you're running away right now. When you run away, this happens. Are you sure that's something you want to do? Ultimately, sometimes it is a choice. Not recognizing that it is a choice, we feel like we don't have options, and that is the choice that we choose. But sometimes you just have to let them make that negative choice. You have to let them go through and realize.
Yes.
Um, yeah, so I think a lot of it is just making the negative choice, making the false decision, making a mess of yourself.
Yeah. Because the autonomy and the sense of personal power is definitely a key ingredient, yeah, to healing. If you take that away from someone and treat them like they can't make their own choice, they can't be trusted to discover what's best for them. We can't create another person's reality, but that doesn't help create the empowerment. It's a factor that does the opposite. It feeds the story that this person can't trust themselves, that they need the external guidance. I'll read a bit more of this one, if that seems good. Over the last 2 decades, psychologist Richard Tedeschi and his colleagues have made the empirical study of post-traumatic growth their mission. While Tedeschi admits that the idea itself is ancient, surely you've heard the maxim, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. He explains that it has only been in the last 25 years or so that this phenomenon, the possibility of something good emerging from the struggle with something very difficult, has been the focus of systematic theorizing and empirical investigation. So for me, that's key. There's this thing which has been this ancient awareness, but now just for a quarter of a century, actually for like your lifespan, science has been attempting to explain this thing. And so Sean Aker, I think that's how we pronounce his name, I'm not sure, says, thanks to this study, thanks to Richard Tedeschi's study, today we can say for certain, with certainty, scientific, objective certainty, not just anecdotally, that great suffering or trauma can actually lead to great positive change across a wide range of experiences. And then he lists increases in spirituality, compassion for others, openness, and even eventually overall life satisfaction. After trauma, people also report enhanced personal strength and self-confidence, as well as a heightened appreciation for and a greater intimacy in their social relationships.
I mean, it makes me think back to yesterday. Like, um, was working with a girl who tried to run away. She later on tried to attack me, um, was very just upset. Like, there was something going on in her mind that was replaying from the past that wasn't necessarily happening now. Later, after, we both ended up apologizing to each other. And we felt like this stronger connection
Mm.
because we had gone through that together.
Mm.
So I think there is a sense of like having seen me in this state, this vulnerability,
Mm.
and being able to be that true, raw, unearthed self does create, a stronger sense of confidence, because it's like, I mean, depending on your circumstances, right? Like, she was lucky she had me to be there unconditionally. In the opposite realm, where you're alone and you don't really have that person to kind of witness you or to give you that unconditional love, I think that's where it kind of comes from within more. Like you do start to feel like a sense of confidence of like, wow, I've been through a lot, and I'm still here and I'm still alive. And it's like the sense of accomplishment, right? It's like a reset in your brain that kind of happens, it feels like. Um, and you do feel like a sense of more connected to your environment. Like, I don't know how to fully explain it, but it's kind of like you go away on vacation in your brain for a little while and then you come back to work and it's like, oh, okay. Yeah, maybe things aren't so bad, or maybe there are alternatives that I wasn't seeing in this kind of more heightened state. After she had settled down, she had like this greater appreciation. Um, I don't know if I'm just like circling now.
We're circling, but we're circling in. It's not, it's
It's like the mountain.
exactly, it's a fruitful circling. And it's a nice contrast with the very linear, of scientific, rational account, which we're not disowning. Like it's a lot of it is resonating, but we're somewhat skeptical. At least parts of us are skeptical of the faith in reason there, when we are, and the attempts to turn it into either a scientific explanation or to kind of make it a life hack kind of thing, because it's not. It's messier than that, and there's the risk of skipping that face down in the arena component and allowing the person who's experiencing trauma to be face down and to get up. I mean, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing, I was physically assaulted in Minneapolis near the beginning of my period of living there. I thought I was being killed, and they were kicking me in the head, and I had crutches. They were breaking those. So I personally did experience this moment of rising up from having been physically assaulted, and
I still can't believe that happened to you.
it was a massive catalyst in my life. And I think, if in my experience, if things hadn't already been like falling to pieces before then, I was aware that I hadn't explored Minneapolis, I hadn't really made any friends, I hadn't been to any music events, and I was a songwriter from before. And I was thinking, this is a shame. I'm losing opportunities, and I'm not in touch with my full self. Before then, prior to then, I was getting messages like, that's not compatible with being a professor, because that was my job. And, you can't go to the songwriter event. That's not allowed if you have this social identity. And because I was new to the US and to US higher education system, I was assuming that was probably true, and I needed to invest my energy in getting a proper tenure track job. So I wasn't songwriting. I was just following the advice. Then I thought I was getting killed, and then I was alive. And I thought, wow, thank goodness I'm alive. Now I'll do things that are in alignment with what I sense is right for me. And so then I started writing new songs. This interview series and all of the other music related things that I did, there's no way in which they would have existed if I hadn't had that face down in the arena experience, combined with the sense of being a bit alienated from my authentic self anyway. So yeah, I have a similar experience to you insofar as reading up about these theories of post-traumatic growth, and then thinking, how does that align with, to what extent does it align with my experience, my sense of how integration worked. We've reached the end of part one of our interview, and we're going to carry on with neurosis and human growth, part two, in a new location momentarily.
Okay. Sounds good.